Okay, I will get started then since we are at 11:05 and hopefully if more people want to roll in, they can. Um, Welcome everybody. Today I will be talking to you a little bit about a decolonized and mind-body approach to working with immigrants and children of immigrants. Just a disclaimer, a lot of my kind of topics and techniques I talk about, although they're catered towards immigrants and children of immigrants, and I tend to use them with this population when I'm working with clients. You can use a lot of these techniques and tips with other populations as well, just to keep that in mind moving forward. Oh, oops. So going over the objectives, we will be covering three main topics today. So firstly, I will be talking about how epigenetic influences mental health. This essentially will be about exploring the biology behind intergenerational trauma. And why I feel like this topic is really important and something that I tend to provide psychoeducation on with my clients is because there is still a lot of stigma within the immigrant community regarding mental health. And what I found is that providing some sort of biological basis or explaining the science behind why people may be struggling with mental health is really, really helpful. And almost to some of my clients that I work with in this population helps to validate their experience a little bit more. So that is why I feel like understanding and explaining epigenetics to immigrant populations can be really helpful in them understanding kind of what's going on with their mental health a little bit. Um, the second topic I will be going over is how to incorporate a decolonized lens when working with immigrants. I think that we should be incorporating a decolonized lens when working with anyone, but I think particularly this is effective with immigrant populations because it really gives them back some of that power that they may have lost in their lives. And also it's a good way to explore relational privilege in the therapeutic room. And then lastly, I talk about a mindfulness technique that is helpful in regulating emotions. It allows you to slow down and reconnect with your body during times of racialized stress. A bit about me before we get started. So, my name is Jasmine. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania a few years ago with my master's in counseling. So, I work as a psychotherapist at Space to Reflect. I'm very, very passionate about working with queer folk, immigrants, and POC. I myself am a queer Indian woman of color. And my parents are immigrants. They immigrated from India in the 70s or 80s. So I'm very, very passionate about working with this population. And a lot of, just the things I talk about in this presentation, I may be pulling from personal experiences or anecdotes at times, or sharing some case studies as well, because I myself belong to this population. And also, I'm very, very passionate about providing care for this population, especially because there is a lot of stigma surrounding mental health when it comes to immigrant folks. And so just spreading awareness and making sure that care is accessible to these folks is really important to me. For fun, I'm very into fiber arts and I love to travel. So that's a bit about me. So, what is epigenetics? So, epigenetics is how environmental factors and life experiences can influence gene expression. I'm sure we have all heard about the nature versus nurture debate, or biology versus learning. Um, I know we talked about that so much in my college courses and even a little bit in my master's courses, but just to refresh people, there's a huge debate as to whether biology, genetics, and nature kind of impacts who we are and how who we grow up to be, um, versus whether it's nurturing or what you learn or your context around you that is influencing who you end up becoming. Um, and people have fallen into various camps into what they believe, whether nature is more important or nurture. Um, but the reality is that both things are very important in affecting development and who we end up being as adults and as children. Um, in the past, genes were seen as being set in stone. So biology was seen as being biology. No, there's nothing you can do to change that. But this is not the case. Our genes are relatively set in stone. However, we contain chemical markers that affect how genes will be expressed. Um, so the study of gene expression and the chemical markers that affect gene expression are epigenetics. Lots of things can influence epigenetics. Positive and negative ancestral, fetal, and early childhood experiences can change these chemical markers in a good or bad way. Um, when these chemical markers are changed, this in turn affects which genes are turned on and off. Um, when children experience toxic stress, so this might be adverse childhood experiences, maybe they're experiencing sexual abuse at home or neglect, or maybe their parents are fighting a lot. This kind of toxic stress can lead to epigenetic changes in children. I wanted to go over this rat licking study. There are a lot of rat studies done about epigenetics. It's very fascinating. There was a 2004 study which compared two groups. So there was a rat pup group which had a mom that exhibited high licking behaviors, and licking is supposed to be this affectionate behavior in rats. So like for it'd be the human equivalent of like holding your baby. Um, so they compared a group where the rat mom engaged in a lot of rat licking behavior, and then they compared a group where the rat pups weren't licked as much by their mom. Scientists then studied the DNA as well as the behavior. Um, and both groups showed that there was altered DNA methylation. So essentially, epigenetics were influenced. The chemical markers that change gene expression were different in both groups. The rat pups in the low licking group tended to exhibit more anxious behaviors than the high licking group. So this study shows that from a behavioral standpoint, the behavior of the rats was impacted by their mom licking them or not licking them. But then also from a genetic standpoint, the mom's behavior impacted the rat pup's DNA. Okay, so I wanted to show this quick video. It's about 10 to 15 minutes, but I think it goes over the concept of epigenetics really well. And it also ties epigenetics in with intergenerational trauma, which obviously that is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So I thought it was wonderful. So let me pull this up and play it for you. There might be some ads because I unfortunately I don't pay for YouTube. So sorry about that, y'all.
Have you heard the saying, hurt people hurt people?
Oh, it's saying my screen sharing is paused. I do not want that to be the case. Okay, sorry guys. Okay, hopefully it should work. Hopefully y'all can hear the video.
And you know what else is true? Hurt people often hurt the ones they love. As a pediatrician, I've seen children hurt in so many different ways by the adults who love and care for them. That's why I'm always talking to caregivers about ways to prevent childhood trauma. In my clinical practice, I screen for ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and I provide trauma sensitive care.
That happens a lot, but Safeway could have helped. So don't let that little chip spoil your trip.
Safeway replace. Let's go, boys. The way that I approach work post fatherhood has really been trying to understand.
I also joined an amazing group called Creating a Resilient Community Network in Central Florida to help prevent and heal our community of trauma. As a facilitator, I give workshops on ACEs, resilience, and healing. And I even dedicated a chapter in my new positive parenting book, High Five Discipline, to raising awareness about ACEs and to ensure the way parents discipline is not a source of trauma for kids. Now, when I encounter children who experience trauma and explore their family dynamics, I often see generations of adversity. Like Brian and his little sister, Sarah, at such a young age, they had already experienced their mother battling drug addiction, being in and out of foster care, and was now living with their maternal grandmother who had her own share of past trauma. She strongly believed that what the kids needed when they were misbehaving was old school discipline, you know, spanking, yelling, and shaming. But nothing she did improved their behavior. Brian was in elementary school and already getting into fights, labeled hyperactive and disruptive in the classroom. And grandma said he was a terror at home. In one particular incident, he almost set the house on fire. And Sarah, she had global developmental delays and behavior problems as well. She was 5, but behaved more like a 2-year-old. Right before my eyes, she babbled, whined, and hit to communicate her frustrations. And grandma just hit her back on the bottom, not making the connection that what Sarah truly needed was love, patience, and guidance. You see, Brian and Sarah's story highlights how trauma can pass down through generations. Hurt people, hurt people. So I would like to talk to you today about how the 3 R's, recognize, build resilience, and restore, can help break the cycle of generational trauma. So we can start by asking what happened to Brian and Sarah before they started acting out. So imagine with me just for a moment what had gone on in the midst of all of these traumatic experiences at a microscopic level. Well, their little bodies experienced prolonged, repeated trauma with very little nurturing and protective caregiving. And the science of childhood trauma tells us this created toxic stress, elevating the body's stress hormones like cortisol and damaging and dysregulating their brain and body systems, and even set the stage for Brian and Sarah to pass these dysfunctional processes on to their children. Now, we can explain some of this intergenerational transmission of trauma through epigenetics, or the study of how our behaviors and environments can create changes that alter the way our genes are expressed. Each one of our cells in our body contains genes, which houses our genetic code or blueprint for all of our functioning. And there are chemical switches above the gene that can turn on or off in response to the environment that create alterations affecting the way the genes work. And these alterations can pass on to the next generation. For example, we know certain moms who experience trauma have epigenetic changes called DNA methylation, which is associated with higher levels of depression and PTSD. And those same changes can show up in the child. And also these moms may have maladaptive behaviors that creates an environment to further traumatize the child. These are biopsychosocial mechanisms that perpetuate trauma. Other epigenetic changes that researchers describe occur in glucocorticoid receptors, which regulate glucose and lipid metabolism, and also telomere length responsible for cellular aging. In other words, toxic stress may lead to families with diabetes, high cholesterol, and even early death. So it makes sense that we heal and protect what happens to us so the long-term effects of toxic stress don't reach future generations. The good news is our brains can rewire, our bodies can heal, and epigenetic changes are reversible. We can have a positive impact on the way our genes work, and we can overcome adversity and create a bright future for generations to come. So, how do we do it? Well, instead of passing down hurt, we need to pass down healing. And the 3 R's can help. Recognize, build resilience, and restore can help break the cycle of generational trauma. Recognize the symptoms of trauma you may be experiencing. Has something bad happened to you and you find yourself fearful, sad, numb, hopeless, or depressed? Are you experiencing panic, anxiety, finding yourself irritable or angry? Do you feel like you need something to take the edge off? Are you finding it difficult to complete the task at hand? Your focus is gone. Are you self-medicating your pain? Stop right there because these are symptoms of trauma. Recognize and then ask for help. Finding a qualified mental health therapist can help address the symptoms of trauma. Therapists can provide trauma-focused interventions like child-parent psychotherapy or trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy to help you manage your thoughts and feelings, change maladaptive patterns and practices, and develop positive coping skills. Also, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR, can help to repair injury by helping the brain to focus and reprocess traumatic memories. And the second R is resilience. Resilience is simply the ability to overcome adversity. And you can build resilience by surrounding yourself with systems of support. This could be your family or friends or a significant other. It could be your therapist and a support group, or even your church family and your pastor or a coach or a teacher. Having healthy relationships can provide the safe, stable, nurturing connections and positive experiences your brain and body need to reset. Also, finding a sense of purpose and practicing gratitude can help. I like to share a personal story about how resilience works. As a child, I experienced various forms of trauma, but that's just a part of my story because I had way more positive childhood experiences. I was raised by a village of people who loved and nurtured me. My Nana was and still is my favorite. I was an excellent student. I was very active in school, playing sports. I played in the band. I sang in the choir at church and at school. You see, having all of these healthy relationships, safe environments, and positive experiences helped me get through tough times and helped me heal. Now, that doesn't mean that the trauma didn't hurt and I don't remember it, but what it means is that I didn't break and I flourished through good and bad times. I owe my success as a pediatrician, wife, and mom to the gift of resilience. And the last R is restore. Restore the brain and body through healing practices.
In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to teach you a productivity system that is only now becoming popular due to AI. Right now, you might be using to-do lists.
Pediatrician, ACE champion, and California's first Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, prescribes healing practices. She advises that we eat a well-balanced, healthy meal. Yes, drink plenty of water, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, but also get adequate amounts of sleep and regular exercise. I love her advice to practice mindfulness by getting out in nature. Take a walk, sit on a park bench and chat with a friend, and remember to breathe deeply. She also supports the value of healthy relationships and mental health intervention when needed. Recognize, build resilience, and restore. The three R's work together to regulate a dysfunctional stress response system and enhance the brain and body's healing powers. We all will experience something traumatic in life. And as much as we try to prevent it, children will experience adversity too. According to psychotherapist Kristen Langley-Obal, we repeat what we don't repair. I'm asking you to repair today. You can break the cycle of trauma in your family. You can repair and pass down healing. And you can build up your next generation. Thank you.
Sorry, guys. Give me 1 second to share my screen again. It is loading, but I really like that video because it explores the idea of toxic stress for children, and trauma obviously can cause a lot of toxic stress, and then it also talks about how this can be passed down from generation to generation, via epigenetics, so the biological aspect of it, and then obviously also in a learned way. And specifically, the TEDx speaker talks about the DNA methylation, and in the mom, like the example she gives, and then how they found that that same methylation was present in her children as well. And so the biological and epigenetic component of this is so strong, and it's so important to uh, grasp when working with folks who've experienced adverse childhood events, toxic stress, trauma, etc. I wanted to talk about another rat study. Um, so, in this experiment, researchers taught male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossoms. They essentially paired the scent of cherry blossoms with a mild foot shock. The male mice learned to associate that smell with being hurt. 2 weeks later, they bred these male mice with females, and they had mice pups, rat pups. Um, the rat pups were raised to adulthood and had never been exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms. Yet, when these rat pups caught a whiff of cherry blossoms for the first time, they became incredibly anxious and fearful. They had a similar response to the male mice that were exposed to the cherry blossom and mild foot shocks. Um, they were even born with the cherry blossom detecting neurons in their noses and had more brain space devoted to cherry blossom smelling. So essentially, that fear center in their brain was primed to expect um, being hurt and harmed when they smelled this. The memory transmission extended out to another generation when these male mice that weren't exposed to the mild foot shock were bred, and similar results were found. I just thought this is so cool. It explains epigenetics so concretely, and it's this is not even necessarily a behavioral thing. It's not like these rat pups parents taught them to fear the smell of the cherry blossoms, right? Like this purely was passed on in the DNA, which is really cool. And it's rarely ever this simple, right? It's rarely either or, that it's completely something that's passed down in DNA and it doesn't have a behavioral or learning component to it. It is almost always both things. But I just thought this was so fascinating. So, connecting epigenetics with intergenerational trauma. Suppose your great grandparents lived through colonization. Although you and your parents and your grandparents may have not experienced colonization directly, your great grandparents' experiences with colonization will indirectly affect their kin. And this is not just from a behavioral, financial, social, and learning standpoint, although all those things are very important. And in my work with clients, I, of course, explore those. Your great grandparents' experience with colonization is a trauma that has changed the way their genes express themselves. It's changed their epigenetics. They've maybe experienced toxic stress from the trauma of colonization. This affects their health and actions. This toxic stress that is influencing their epigenetics will most likely be passed down to their kids and then their kids' kids, going on and on. The adverse effects of colonization are literally in your DNA. And if these traumas, these experiences, this toxic stress is not addressed, is not worked through, um, is not recognized, um, then the mental health consequences of this will continue to be passed down, and the gene expression will continue to be affected by the experience of colonization and the after effects of that and the intergenerational trauma aspects of that. I love this graphic because it goes through some examples of intergenerational trauma and like the behavioral aspects of it, and then obviously it has the little like DNA helix next to it to emphasize the epigenetics aspect. But just to go over some of these examples, I'll go over Jane and Ashok. Um, so to start with Jane, her parents, her great great grandparents, sorry, survived the European wars. Um, this surviving war, going through war at all is very traumatic. And the trauma of that is passed down through Jane's ancestors. So maybe her great great grandparents experienced PTSD from surviving the European wars. This may have led to alcoholism in the next generation, which could have led to sexual abuse in the next generation, which then could lead to a lot of emotional repression in Jane. And it doesn't have to go down exactly like this. This is just a possible example of what it could look like, from a learning perspective to and behavioral perspective, to be experiencing certain mental health disorders or struggle with mental illness, and then how that is passed down directly and indirectly through kin. Um, and then, of course, there's the epigenetics component of this. Jane's great great grandparents' epigenetics have been altered due to surviving European wars. And if they haven't addressed the effects of those wars on them and their mental, physical well being, those epigenetics are most likely going to be passed down to their kids. And if their kids aren't addressing, how how their parents trauma of surviving the European wars is affecting them and affected their parents, then that most likely is going to be passed down to their kids and so forth. Um, so even though Jane has no experience of surviving war at all, she is very much impacted by her great great grandparents' experience. I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over Ashok's example. And the reason why I like this example a lot is because I actually see this, like the passing down of the various mental illnesses or um, problems that people face. I see that a lot with my clients, this exact sequence. It doesn't have to be this exact sequence at all, um, but it is often this sequence. Because intergenerational trauma sometimes is passed down in a very specific way. So with Ashok, his great great grandparents survived famines and oppression in British India. So colonization, which is the example I was talking about in the previous slide as well. Um, so colonization is incredibly traumatic and scary, and it left a lot of Indian people very poor and stripped of resources. This can lead to a lot of poverty consciousness. So, even if Ashok and his parents are incredibly wealthy or are relatively well off, they still maybe, have a scarcity mindset or be in the survival mode because their great great grandparents were stripped of wealth and land and resources, and they were incredibly scared because of that, and were always trying to fight to survive because of that. Um, this poverty consciousness could lead to suffocating shame based societal rules. So when you are in this fight or flight survival mode, you're wanting to do anything you can to survive and be okay. Um, and sometimes living outside of the norm of what society expects from you seems as if it's not going to guarantee that survival. And I've seen this with so many of my clients. Like, I work with a lot of children of immigrants, and their parents' expectations of them is very much like societally based. They want their kids to marry within um, their culture, religion, socioeconomic status, etc. Their kids may not want all of that, but the parents want and are putting that pressure on their kids because they're afraid that if what kind of life is my kid going to have? Is my kid going to be okay if they don't follow these strict norms that we follow too to ensure our safety? So that is being passed down. This is a really stressful live to feel as if you don't always, like, it's not always about you and what you want, but it is that you have to subscribe to these norms in order to be okay, in order to survive and be accepted, which can lead to a lot of anxiety, even feelings of depression, because you're not being your authentic true self because you feel like you need to be someone else and do other things in order to survive. So that obviously from a behavioral and learning standpoint, that's maybe how that's passed down. But then also the survival of famines and oppression is being passed down from an epigenetic standpoint to Ashok. So yeah, he has not starved, he has not been directly oppressed by the British people at that time, but he is very much dealing with the effects of that because his parents maybe didn't address the mental health consequences of what of that intergenerational trauma. So this is very cool graphic and gives some specific examples to what I'm talking about. So incorporating the decolonized lens when working with immigrants. Western and non-decolonized therapy is very much focused on the self and is very individualistic because Western culture is, of course, incredibly individualistic. However, I found that especially when working with POC folk and immigrant folk, this focus on the self doesn't cut it. Like, it's incredibly empowering at times to feel as if you have control and power over your journey and healing. However, the self is not just the individual. We are made up of our ancestors, we're made up of their experiences, our community, and our people. And understanding our deep and recent past, especially for POC and marginalized folks, is vital to understanding our present way of being. Especially because our deep and recent past might have contained a lot of trauma and oppression that is affecting us to this day because one, trauma and oppression still exist, and POC and marginalized folks experience that a lot more than their non POC and non marginalized counterparts. But then also they're dealing with the repercussions of oppression that their great grandparents might have experienced or their parents might have experienced. And all of this past has very much to do with who we are in the present and our mental health in the present. So, connecting immigration with trauma, I view immigration as a trauma for many people. This is an interesting way of viewing immigration. I don't think a lot of people tend to consider immigration trauma. Um, and so I think especially when it's like someone is fleeing their country due to safety concerns or if there's a war or genocide going on, I think people more likely would view that as a trauma. But I would argue that even if immigration is a choice, like maybe you're not being persecuted in your homeland, maybe you want to move to have a better life for your kids or provide them with more resources or provide yourself with more resources, it can still be incredibly traumatic, even if it is more of a choice. Leaving one's motherland can strip away one's connection with their homeland, their family, their community resources, comfort, and cultural know how. Um, I often will see that people who do immigrate from less of the survival standpoint feel as if the choice is very self made, and therefore these feelings of loss and trauma are pushed down. And I don't want to pathologize this at all. It makes a lot of sense. Um, it's a lot easier to not deal with the cognitive dissonance of it all, right? It's a lot easier to be like, I made this choice, I left home, and I'm very, very happy with it, and everything is perfect about it, and I've only gained things from it. It's a lot harder to be like, yes, I've gained things from this, and there are aspects of it that make me incredibly happy. There are also aspects of it that were incredibly harmful and things that I've lost or experiences that I've had that I would have never wanted and didn't choose to have by immigrating. Um, so it's important, I feel, to acknowledge that people like immigrants that may be like pushing down that trauma as a survival mechanism. And when working with immigrants from a decolonized lens, I like to bring a little bit of that to the surface, gently, of course. But I think it's important to explore. People who immigrate also often become emotionally stuck at the age they immigrated. Um, and this is often just an impact of trauma, right? When you experience trauma, some of that emotional maturing and development may get stuck or slow down because you kind of remain stuck in that trauma. And then the people who immigrate may not even be at that emotional age that they immigrated at. So suppose someone came to the US when they were 20. Um, they may not even emotionally be at the age of 20 because of previous personal, familial, and ancestral traumas. Their emotional age may be a lot lower than that based off of what they've gone through. This can have huge repercussions. This, of course, can have adverse effects on the person who is stuck at that lower emotional age. They may not be able to get in tune with themselves. The effects of trauma might be having a larger impact because they're not able to name their emotions and process them. And then it also has a huge impact on their children who may emotionally surpass their parents' emotional age because maybe they have more tools or they're going to therapy or they have friends to talk about what's going on. Um, and their parents may not have the same resources. And this can really change the parent child dynamic a lot in a way that's not always healthy. Um, Focusing a little bit on effects of immigration trauma on immigrant children. Due to intergenerational trauma, children of immigrants are affected by their parents' immigration in many ways. Although they themselves did not leave their homeland directly, they also experience a loss of homeland. There's a lot of identity confusion. How do you adequately embrace your motherland and your non-ancestral home? What does an adequate embraceal of those two things even look like? If they're second generation, they may struggle with their family's rejection of the host nation's culture, compared to their own identity development journey. Um, so maybe second generation children of immigrants want to engage with their host nation's culture a little more. Um, their parents aren't about that. This can lead to a lot of high conflict at home. And this can lead to the kid being labeled as bad or rebellious or disappointing their family. And this, of course, is frustrating for the family, and this, of course, is harmful for the kid who isn't bad because they're wanting to do something different from their family, or they're at a different place in their identity development. Um, there's also a lot of intense pressure to succeed and conform to familial expectations due to their family's sacrifice. So a lot of families will make it very clear to their children that they did make a sacrifice, or that they immigrated for their kids. And so now their kids has to live up to this certain, level of success, and accomplish and do certain things in order to make it worth it, or to make their family proud and justify the immigration. Um, and this bar is usually incredibly high. It's usually making a lot of money, marrying someone who belongs to the right background, very specific background, um, having kids, etc. Um, that's a lot to put on someone who may not want that. It's a lot to put on someone who may also want that, right? These are high bars to meet. And for children of immigrant, if they're not meeting those bars, there's a feeling of failure, and feeling like they have to do everything in their power to try to please their parents and make this happen for them. Children of immigrants also tend to struggle with people pleasing as a way to fit into both cultures, and this is also a survival mechanism. So it's very hard to find your way, navigate two different ways of being, acting, consuming various different media, etc. And it sometimes feels easier and protective to go along with, you know, whatever's happening in each cultural space, even if you don't necessarily want to do that, or to make sure everybody's happy in both spaces, so that you can protect yourself. Immigrant children also may feel parentified due to parents' lower emotional age and lack of language and cultural skill acquisition in the host nation. So, parentified essentially means that a kid may take on the role of a parent for their parents, um, or their younger sibling. So, this could look like, say, someone comes from India to the US and they have a kid in the US. Their English maybe they're not as fluent in English compared to their kid who's gone through the school system here. And so at the age of 14 or 15, they're having their kid sign and read legal documents for them and fill out their tax forms. That's definitely something that, kids that young don't tend to do for their parents. But because this kid is parentified, they may do something like that for their parents. So yeah, that's again a lot of pressure put on the immigrant child. Um, it also makes them feel like they're caretaking instead of being taken care of, which they need, as all children do. There's also an increased rate of depression, anxiety, and imposter syndrome when in this population. Um, and the imposter syndrome, I think, connects very much with this identity development aspect. Like, where do I fit in? Who am I when I'm around my parents versus when I'm with my friends at school? How do I fit in? It's a hard question to ask. I wanted to go over the immigrant identity development stages. Um, these labels can sometimes be helpful for clients to put a name to the experience they're having. So, acculturation is how immigrants navigate their host nation identity and their origin nation identity. Separation is how immigrants may preserve their origin nation identity while rejecting host nation identity. So, this and assimilation, the next term, are opposite of each other. Assimilation is when immigrants may adopt the host nation identity while relinquishing origin nation identity. Integration is when immigrants combine their origin and host nation identities. Marginalization is when immigrants may turn away from both host and origin nation identities. Um, I love these stages. They're not linear, right? So it's not like you go from one to the other. You can jump around. You can be in one stage, go to a different stage, then go back to the previous stage. Um, and exploring identity development stages with immigrants and children of immigrants can be really helpful to give a name to their experience and also give them some autonomy. So, okay, you're at the stage of separation. How do you feel about that? Is that a stage that you want to continue to be in? What would it be like to explore a different stage? What would it be like to not explore a different stage? I very much like to give clients autonomy in this. What I think they should or shouldn't be doing has nothing to do with them, right? That's not the work. The work is where they think they want to be at, and if they want to move towards where they want to be at or not. And then if they do, then how do we do that? Um, Certain topics that I like to explore with my immigrant clients from a decolonized lens is I want to create that space to process immigration as a trauma because they most likely have not been given that space before. Some questions I like to ask: what has been taken from you? What have you gained from this experience? What do you hope for yourself when you immigrated? How have your expectations been met or unmet? How has immigration affected your family back home? How has it affected your family in the host nation? What do you miss about home? I also like to work with clients to develop more emotional awareness because, as I said, the emotional intelligence and development might have been stalled when they immigrated. So I want to create a space for clients where they get to grieve and they get to experience whatever they want to experience when it comes to immigration. I want them to feel their anger. I want them to feel their happiness, process what they gained and lost. Just really giving that space and allowing them to take up space with their emotions. I also like to explore the identity stage they're in at, which I talked about before, and just allow them to explore that idea for themselves. And then lastly, exploring relational privilege in the therapeutic relationship. So this is honestly, I think, one of the most important things that I like to explore with clients. I feel like as therapists, it can be kind of scary sometimes to bring up like your own privilege and how that may or may not be coming to the therapeutic room and how your privilege or lack of and your client's privilege or lack of may be interacting or not interacting. Your client is most likely not going to bring it up. Like I've never had a client bring it up. So I think when you as a therapist bring that conversation into the room, it can open up a lot of conversation and insight for what's going on in the therapeutic room, and create feelings like it can increase the therapeutic relationship for the better. So now moving on to the mindfulness part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about CLCPE. This is an acronym for a mind body technique developed by one of my professors in my grad program, Howard Stevenson. He developed this technique for Black folk to use during time of racialized stress, but this technique can be used at any time. Um, and I will go over what the different letters stand for. C stands for calculate. During this stage, you calculate in your body from a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 2 emotions you're feeling. The next part is L, locate. I want you to notice where you feel these emotions in your body and what sensations you're experiencing connected to these emotions. Maybe you're experiencing happiness and you feel a tingling in your chest. Maybe you're feeling anger and you feel a pressure in your shoulders. C, the next C stands for cognitions. What thoughts and memories are coming up for you related to this physical and emotional sensations? And then lastly, the B stands for breathe in and the E stands for exhale. I have my own additions to CLCBE. That's the basic technique that I just talked about. But when you're not using this in a state of heightened emotional arousal, I encourage people during the second C, so cognition stage, to instead of just reflecting on your memories and experiences related to the emotions and physical sensations, I want people to do something more active with it. So maybe journal it out, paint your feelings, draw what you're thinking or feeling, sculpt, dance, shape, voice memo it out. I like a more somatic and artistic version of processing than just thinking about it. Also, breathing in and exhaling once doesn't always help to de stress and downregulate my clients. I often encourage clients to pick up a deep breathing exercise of their choice. My favorite is box breathing, which is essentially you draw a box in the air visually. You can do this, but I guess you could draw it too if you want it physically. Um, and then this line of the box, you breathe in for 4. Then for this line of the box, you hold your breath for 4. Then for this bottom line of the box, you breathe out for 4. And then for this side line of the box, you hold for 4. And you can repeat that as many times as you want till you start to feel your body get out of fight or flight, or you just find yourself feeling a little more calm. It's also helpful to practice CLCBE when experiencing a more neutral or comfortable emotion to get the hang of it. This isn't just time for stress. Awesome. So now I want y'all to try. It literally takes less than a minute. And this will give a little, 1 minute break in session. So as a reminder, calculate and rate your emotions on a scale from 1 to 10. Locate these emotions or any in your body along with bodily sensations. Reflect on cognitions and memories associated with bodily sensations and emotions. Breathe in, deep diaphragmatic breath in, and breathe out. Feel free to make whatever modifications work best for you. All right, so I'll wait for a minute. See y'all can do it. All right. Okay, well, you can't share out, but feel free to reflect for yourself kind of how this technique was for you and whether you use this again or not. And if you use this with people you're working with. All right, the next exercise I wanted to talk about, and this is the last part of my presentation, is the genogram exercise. So essentially what a genogram is, I'm gonna call it a glorified family tree, but it is a glorified family tree. But essentially, I like to create a genogram with when working with immigrants and children of immigrants because it's a great way to explore their family history and how ancestral experiences may be affecting the client presently. A genogram may also help the client feel more connected to their past and help them explore their identity in relationship to their other family members. So again, we're bringing in that collectivistic, ancestral exploration with the genogram. It's not just about the self. Um, and an example I wanted to give was when I did the genogram exercise. I realized that one of my aunts is a history professor in India, and I love history. Like I've always been very interested in it. I always thought it was kind of random, but when I did this genogram and I noted that connection between my aunt and it just felt really nice. And I felt more connected with my family and my relatives when I noted that connection. The genogram helped me to do that. Also, genograms can be helpful in possibly uncovering family secrets or things that were hidden in the family due to shame and stigma. This I feel like is so important when exploring mental illness in the genogram because especially for immigrant folk and POC folk, this can often be very hidden um, in the family, and the genogram helps you hypothesize. Like it may not be true, right? It might just be what you're thinking or something you've noticed, but it allows you to sometimes connect the dots more so than if you weren't engaging in an exercise like this. So an example of that is my grandfather struggled with an alcohol addiction, and so does my uncle. But this was never named in our family. And so until I did the genogram, I wasn't really processing that that was something they were struggling with. And then I did the genogram, and I was like, oh my gosh, like wow, they struggle with mental illness. Like this isn't just something that they do that my family like talks about behind closed doors or shames. This is them struggling with mental illness and our family isn't processing it in that way at all. So what you add on the genogram? Major events, so immigration would be one thing, but war, 9/11, anything that may have left a deep impact on the individuals. Cultural factors, so gender, sexuality, immigration status, religion, whether they experienced homophobia or sexism, mental health issues, medical conditions, traumas, and here you could add immigration as a trauma, addictions, relationship dynamics. This one is really cool because you can visually see patterns happening, right? Like maybe you're this like maybe the like enmeshment dynamic that is happening with you and your parents was present with your parents and their parents and going back and back. And then the role that family members play as well. So just a little preview, you draw the family tree, you name the players, you determine the relationships, and then update as needed. Um, the genogram is not a one and done thing. Family dynamic shift, things happen, secrets are revealed, and it's helpful to update the genogram and kind of see how these things affect relationship dynamics and affect the genogram. So I was gonna have y'all draw a genogram in session, but I don't really think we have too much time, and I want to make sure that if you all have any questions, you can ask. But essentially, you would start with your grandparents, then the second generation would be your parents and their siblings, then the third generation is yourself and your siblings and important cousins, and then a fourth generation could be your children, and important nieces and nephews. So yeah, I've already talked about kind of what you can name, but this is just a little bit more of a detailed list. And these are the basic symbols that I tend to use, and a lot of people tend to use with genograms, but get creative with it. Like, I don't think this just has to be a genogram exercise. I think it could also become artistic. Like, maybe you're associating certain colors with certain relationships or dynamics or traumas, or certain shapes with those things as well. Determine the relationships. That's the next step. Here are some symbols that people use to notate the emotional relationships. Um, so yeah, you can use those or come up with your own, and then update them as needed. Um, and sometimes when you come back to the genogram, like suppose you do it, you get what you need to get out of it, and then a few months later you come back to it. There may be something new that you notice or something like new that's coming up for you that you want to explore with it. Reflection questions for the genogram. What stands out to you? What emotions are you feeling right now? What reactions are you having? How does your family deal with emotions or pain? How do you deal with other people's emotions or pain? So these two questions, they may be connected, right? Maybe the way your family deals with emotions or pain is how you do it. And maybe that's healthy or not healthy. How is your past showing up in your present? This is so important with the intergenerational trauma, right? How is your ancestors' experience affecting you now? How is it showing up in your behaviors, actions, emotions, thoughts, feelings? Are there any familiar patterns that resemble what you grew up with? What are some generational blessings and burdens that have been passed down? What burdens would you like to end with your generation? What blessings would you like to pass down to your children? I love that question because it's the strengths based approach. We're not just about how has my family harmed me? How have or how has colonization or other traumas or immigration harmed me, right? That can sometimes be a very bleak outlook. It's sometimes nice to be like, well, this is how I'm benefiting. This is what I've gained, and that allows you to focus on what is going well. And then what feels important for you to focus on for the next half year. So the genogram can be used for goal setting, right? Maybe you're noticing a pattern in your family that you want to break. Maybe you noticed a relationship wasn't as strong or was enmeshed, and that's a dynamic you want to shift over the next year and a half. So you can use it to set goals for yourself as well, which I think is really cool. Um, All right, that is it for me. That is my presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening and being here. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, so we can get started on that.
Jasmine, so far we don't have anything in the Q&A, and I realized that as moderator, I'm not able to put anything in the Q&A box. So I was just going to ask you myself. When you teach clients about intergenerational trauma, is there ever a time where there is maybe some tension around them seeing that as like an excuse for the abuse that they may have endured by their parents? So I want to be cautious of invalidating their experience by maybe seemingly explaining away their parents' behavior through that intergenerational trauma. And I'm just wondering how you balance that.
Yeah. So I don't feel like it's come up, at least with my clients, because in sessions I tend to very much emphasize that there is no excuse. Like, even if there is a genetic component to what is going on, that is not the full picture, right? There is that behavioral learning standpoint, and ultimately it is still their responsibility to address that. Like, your parents, even though they have this genetic basis for maybe what's going on, it's still on them to do the work to process that and work on that and try to not pass that down to you. So the intergenerational trauma aspect of it, or sorry, the epigenetic and intergenerational aspect of it is also more for like clients to kind of understand their deep and recent past a little bit. It's definitely not like a, well, this is why this is the case and this is why it can't change. Like, my focus at least more is like, this explains maybe why you're struggling with XYZ mental illness, even if you feel like technically you live a very like privileged life, or you don't feel like you've directly experienced certain hardships. um so I think just emphasizing that there is still responsibility even if there's a biological component, because that's not the only thing going on. I hope that answers your question or clarifies things a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. We did have a question pop up in the chat. So someone asked, how do you handle situations where someone doesn't know or has a complicated tree, like adoption or childhood separation?
Yeah, and honestly, I do not work with a lot of clients that have that kind of complicated family tree, but I think just trying to get as much information as they can. And so sometimes what the genogram exercise looks like is like interviewing people, right? So maybe they can interview their non-biological parents or siblings and get some information from them. Um, and maybe that means like contacting the adoption agency and trying to get some more information from them. Um, or maybe if you know even a general thing, right? Like, okay, maybe my um my biological parents were from South America, specifically maybe they're from Brazil. Okay, like let me do some research about like what age they could have possibly been. Okay, like what was going on for people at that time in Brazil. It's not exact, right? And you may not get that full picture, but you can maybe learn a little bit of something and get some more context, because it seems like these hypothetical individuals that we're talking about just don't have a lot of context to their family and who they are. And so gaining that could be really helpful, even if it's not complete. I hope that's clear, but if you want more clarification, feel free. I honestly have not worked with a client so far that has had that background, so I don't have a lot of experience with that kind of family specifically. But that's what I would suggest, and that's where the starting point that I would go with if we did that.
Great. So any other questions? We have just a few more minutes if anyone else has a question. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion to maybe fill in the blanks with kind of the historical context that you could gather from at least the age that the parents may have been, and knowing what may have been happening in their country of origin at that time. That's going to, like you said, give some context. It's not super
Right.
individualized, but it's something.
Yeah, and in general, with the genogram exercise, I encourage people with all different types of family structures to look into and do research into like history, because that's going to tell you a lot more, and it's going to give you a lot of context as to what your family members and ancestors were experiencing at the time. Of course, it's great to do those individual interviews, but sometimes family members don't want to share. I know when I did my genogram, my family, like, they did not want to open up or talk about things, and you know that might have been because there was some trauma associated with it or whatever. So it's helpful to always do your own research as well when making these genograms. All right, I think unless there are any more questions, which I don't think they are, I should we exit the webinar, or I don't know what we should do to
Yeah,
end it.
yeah. I can close that down.
Okay, thank
Let
you.
me just double check. Yeah, we're all set. Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was really interesting, and definitely I took away some things that I'm gonna use with my clients moving forward. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Okay, I think I don't know how to stop the recording, but we'll be good. We'll figure it out.
Awesome,
Thank you.
awesome.
Bye.